Starting us off with number 10 are the pains of divorce. So back in 1999, Mark Vallejo was a funeral director and he worked at the home with his wife of 2 years, Exley. One night he found a letter in his home that she had written for her lover. They started talking things over and things got a bit heated. Exley called her sister and told her that they were having an argument, but her sister thought nothing of it as it was quite a regular occurrence. The next day, Exley never called her sister back and she never showed up for work either, and on top of that, Mark didn't call in and ask if she was there as he usually did. At least stay consistent, Mark. 3 days later, with no sign of Exley, her sister called the police and Mark admitted that they had a fight but that she just left him. But that didn't really add up because she wouldn't leave her son behind and her car was still very much in their driveway. Did she leave you on foot, Mark? I mean, probably could be, but the police didn't buy it and investigated further. They found out that the day they spoke to Mark, he'd also hosted a closed casket funeral for an elderly woman named Marjorie. Police theorized that maybe Mark put Exley's body in with Marjorie's and buried them both. They were about to exhume the casket when Mark finally admitted to stabbing Exley in her sleep. He didn't want to lose custody of their child or go through an expensive divorce, so he just killed her, which is clearly the next obvious step. Coming in at number 9 is Julie Mott. Maybe some of you will actually know this case since it's quite recent. In 2015, San Antonio, Texas, Julie Mott lost her battle with cystic fibrosis. After her visitation, the home closed for the day, but before they did, somehow someone managed to take Julie's body out of her casket and out of the home. Police initially suspected her ex-boyfriend, who was apparently obsessive and also the last person seen leaving the chapel. But that came up short. Cadaver dogs searched his house, his car, his everything, and found nothing. The second theory was that perhaps someone who objected to cremation took the body, but if that was true, they could have just taken any body in the home. Why Julie's in specific? Third theory was that the home lost her body or had it prematurely cremated. The owner of the home, Robert Dick Tips, yup, that is his real name, denied this and said he was the one who helped organize searches for her body in the first few weeks after the disappearance and even offered a 20 grand reward for information. Fair enough, I'll give you that. Either way, her body was never found till this day, nor did they find out who could have taken it. It still blows my mind how someone did this in broad daylight. How do you escape with a body in broad daylight? At number 8, we have the sobbing. Now this one comes from user SpiceMaster242, who works as an embalmer. During her first shift, she went to the bathroom in the back of the funeral home, and when she came out, she heard a faint sobbing sound as well as feet shuffling on the floor. She knew it was definitely feet because the floor was made of this gravelly material, so it made a specific sound if you walked on it. She followed the sound to a room where they stored embalmed bodies ready for delivery to their individual funeral homes. She thought maybe a family member may have snuck in and was crying, but there was no living person there. The only body in there was a young girl who had shot herself in the side of the head. She still never found out where the sobbing was coming from, but the user did have a semi-heart attack, so there's that. Filling our number 7 slot is the trash man. Now Bobby Wilkes was a 51-year-old funeral director living in Tennessee. His go-to thing was telling families not to watch the lowering of the casket because it would be too emotionally taxing, which is fair. I mean, he could be right. In October 1988, Bobby was giving another family the same talk, so they didn't end up watching the casket lowering, but they were looking at Wilkes. They saw him throw potted flowers into the grave and he didn't even put a lid on the vault. The lid which cost the family an extra $375. They went to the police straight away and had Wilkes arrested. Once this hit the news, it was like a domino effect. Complaint after complaint was being filed against him from previous families. They wanted their loved ones' bodies exhumed to check the real damage he had done. Now at least 10 of the coffins were stuffed to the brim with garbage, and I'm talking bags of hair, bottles, dirty diapers, even dog food. 2 coffins weren't even buried straight, they were buried on their side, and one literally had an arm sticking out of the coffin. But at least they got caskets. One man didn't even get that. He pleaded guilty to 48 different charges and was sentenced to nearly 29 years in prison. Now at number 6 is Death's Grip. This one's from user Kittens, which is just very fitting for someone working in a funeral home. The user used to work in tissue recovery for organ donors, and that includes having to shave the person's arms and legs. One day they were working on a person who had died very recently, so the body was fresh. They held his arm up so they could shave it, and his fingers slowly but surely started curling around the user's hand. Having done this many times, the user knew it was just rigor mortis kicking in, but they were still exceptionally creeped out. I love how they were just freaked out. I would have already by then. What if they just didn't let me go? And also, is it like a baby's grip? They may be small, but when they hold your finger, they really hold it, you know? So is it the same thing? Start of life mimics end of life? Coming in at number 5 is the private goodbye. Now this person used to work at a funeral home during their teen years because apparently working as a waitress or in retail was too mainstream for them. One day after an open casket viewing, a man came in saying he wanted to say goodbye to the deceased privately. And that was a pretty common occurrence, so the user thought nothing of it. They led him to the viewing room and let him be. A few minutes later, the staff heard this loud popping sound and then footsteps of someone running and then a door slam. They ran into the viewing room thinking maybe the guy took off with the body, but it was still there when they got there. But that wasn't the issue. The weird thing was the face just looked strange. The mouth was hanging open weirdly and the skin just didn't seem set like it did before. They realized the dude punched the corpse and then took off. Settle your grudges before you die, people, otherwise someone's gonna punch you in the face. At number 4 is the underwear. So back in 1998 in Kentucky, reports circulated of a break-in at a funeral home, which is just weird because I feel like if you're gonna break in anywhere, make it a bank, not a funeral home. But anyway, the staff looked around for any missing items, but nothing seemed amiss until they looked inside the casket of 9-year-old Brittany Ray Bradley. She died after a fierce 2-year battle with a rare type of cancer, and the home had hosted a visitation for her earlier that day. The thing that went missing was her underwear. When the family was informed, they immediately accused her 31-year-old cousin Mark Calebs of the theft, which is so weird. If they didn't even hesitate to accuse him, he must have been doing something messed up with her or to her before she died, or he must have just been a weirdo in general. Like something was definitely up for them to accuse him that bloody quickly, let's face it. The police checked the camper where he lived, and lo and behold, the underwear was there. There was no sign of evidence of sexual the body, but Mark was charged regardless. Now at number 2 is the head. Back in 1986, at the age of 83, a man called Anthony Parisi passed away. Nothing questionable or shady happened. He died of natural causes, and his body was being held at the Yanantuomo Funeral Home in Mount Vernon. On the 26th of July, employees went to prepare his body for the burial, but when they opened his casket, they saw that his head was literally gone with the wind, just nowhere to be found. They called the police, and they all speculated that there must have been a break-in during the middle of the night, and someone must have used a scalpel or razor and cut his head off, and then proceeded to take the head with them. I mean, why go to all the trouble of cutting his head off if you're not gonna at least take it with you? Nothing was stolen in the home. The home wasn't messed up in any way at all. It was literally just the head which had been stolen. I just want to know, I mean, Anthony founded a grocery store in the area, so it's not like he was like a mafia boss with a bunch of enemies. I really want to know why his head got stolen. And finally, at number 1 are the Pestinikas, and I'm glad I left this one till the end because boy is it a good one. And by good, I mean messed up, so here we go. In 1982, a 90-year-old retired man named Joseph Cly had black lungs, so he went to the hospital. While he was there, he made his own funeral arrangements with Helen and Walter Pestinikas. After staying at the hospital for a good month, he decided to go live with Helen and Walter instead of his stepson, which was already, I feel like, the first red flag in this story, but let's continue. The couple themselves were in their 60s, and they set up Joseph in a converted patio area. 2.5 years later, he was found dead there, but authorities noted the place he was staying at was unfit for human habitation. There was no insulation, no fridge, no sink, and human waste was everywhere. The medical examiner ruled that Joseph had suffered from severe dehydration and starved to death since he hadn't eaten for days before his death. The body was returned to the couple since he paid them for a funeral. He also didn't really have many relatives left, and the ones he did have couldn't afford a funeral for him. So back to Walter and Helen he went. In less than a week after his death, police went back to his room to investigate more, but found that the couple had gotten it cleaned and painted and put a walker in there that wasn't there before. The couple was arrested for holding Joseph captive and starving him to death and then stealing his money. Helen had access to his bank account, and what used to be 35 grand was now only $55. Where did the money go? It's not like Joseph was using it in his tiny room. The couple claimed the autopsy was botched and he died of natural causes. So his body was exhumed, and the medical examiner knew automatically that something was wrong. They were stitching on his stomach area, and his stomach and other organs had been replaced with ones from someone who had eaten before dying. No one knows where these organs came from and where Joseph's went, but the couple were charged with third-degree murder.
Number 10. Moaning dead people. You're working at a funeral home. Late at night, you start hearing moaning. And not fun moaning, Well, you won't want to hear that in a funeral home either. I guess my point is, if you're in a house full of dead people, you don't want to hear any sort of moaning, okay? Pleasurable or otherwise. Well, if you work at a funeral home, this is actually pretty common. When people die, our bodies start to fill with gases. And when those gases escape, the body can make moaning sounds. The technical term for this is spooky toots. The freaky thing about this is usually happens when you're moving the body. You're already doing a creepy job of moving bodies in a funeral home, and then you have this thing sighing at you. No thank you. I think I'm going to keep making YouTube videos and living in a basement apartment. Number 9, ghosts. Now you build a place where you can store dead bodies. Chances are you're gonna get a ghost or two. It could just be staying in a funeral home late at night, could have the overnight security guard feeling a little jumpy. Or maybe the ghosts of dead people follow their bodies to the funeral home, meet a bunch of other dead ghosts, and it's a pretty chill hang, and they decide to stay. All speculations aside, there's been numerous reports of people in funeral homes feeling cold spots, seeing ghostly figures that resemble their loved ones, or even seeing ghosts sitting in the service during funerals. Imagine having to watch your own funeral, seeing everyone who bails. Like, I can't believe Mark isn't here. I helped him move 3 times. There's even this story from a mortician who is doing his mortician thing, getting bodies ready, looking good for their big day. He goes to take a leak, and there's a guy in the bathroom in a blue suit. The man walks past him, he doesn't really get a good look at him, then he goes back to work, and he realized it was the same guy he was working on. 8. A resurrection. Usually if someone dies, they stay dead. I mean, that's a pretty hard and fast rule, no exceptions. Except for like Jesus, and apparently the baby of Swapna Michaelis Revenus. The baby was born July 1st, 2017. She was premature and very underweight. Not a hot start for this little one. The couple and their baby were transferred to another hospital, and sadly the baby passed away. The doctors told Swapna and Michaela that she was too weak, so the parents were crushed. They left to a funeral home to set up arrangements for their daughter. But while they were inside the funeral home, the baby began to move. She pulled a full Jesus 3 days faster. The parents were elated to have their baby back, but they were also furious that the doctor told them that their baby was dead. So they stormed the hospital, and police had to stop them from killing the doctor. Number 7, an extra body. If you work in a funeral home, you must come up with pretty great ideas of how to ditch a body. I mean, I'm not saying I would do it, but say stuff 2 bodies in one casket during a closed casket funeral so nobody knows the body's in there and you dispose of it without anyone noticing. Well, that's exactly what Mark Villela did. He got in a fight with his girlfriend and then stabbed her to death in her sleep. And then he got a big old light bulb over his head. He was like, hey, I have to work a closed casket funeral tomorrow. So he brought his dead girlfriend to the funeral home, stuffed her in a casket with an 89-year-old woman. Everyone sat there and mourned 2 people unknowingly, and Mark thought he was the cleverest guy in town. But when Mark's girlfriend never showed up for work, people got suspicious and started looking for her. Not long after that, he was arrested, and the CCTV footage showed him in the funeral home with her body, stuffing it into the case, and he didn't even run to Mexico. You always run to Mexico. Number 6, a wink. I don't know if you've ever been to a funeral or if you've ever seen them reenacted on TV or in movies, but a very common theme is that the deceased person's eyes are always closed, because there's nothing quite as unsettling as having a dead person staring at you. Well, in one special case, an elderly woman was very proud of her glass eye. I think some old people just get really bored. So she put in her will that she wanted her glass eye to be on display when she passed. And she didn't mean on display like in a nice little box next to her casket. She wanted it in her head, one eye open, so everyone could see her winking. Now, her family and loved ones knew that this was supposed to happen, but the funeral director's assistant didn't. So when she opened the casket, she got a face full of dead old lady winking at you. In the funeral business, they call that a winky pinkaboo. Number 5, a clown. What happens to a clown after they die? Do they go to the great big top in the sky? Or do they get shot of a cannon straight into hell? It probably depends on how many kids they made cry. But what I can tell you is I never want to go to a clown funeral. Clowns are creepy enough as it is without the risk of one of them crawling back to life from the underworld. However, if you work at a funeral home, you don't really get to choose which funerals you go to, and apparently on this day, you didn't get to choose what you wore either. During this clown's funeral, everyone working the funeral had to be dressed up as clowns. Also, it shouldn't be surprised that many of the people who came to the funeral were also dressed up as clowns, and they painted a single tear on their face in makeup. Baggy clothes, a love for rhyming, single tears painted on their faces. I didn't know thugs and clowns had so much in common. Number 4, a missing body. This one isn't so much what was found, but what wasn't. Back in 2015, a young woman by the name of Julie Mott sadly passed away. Her family went to the funeral home to make necessary arrangements. The next morning, when one of the funeral directors went to go check on the body, it was gone. Now my first response would be looting because a zombie apocalypse has started. But this funeral director was a little more grounded. The funeral director contacted the family, who then contacted the police. The police launched an investigation. Now there wasn't much to go on except for one really creepy dude. Apparently there had been someone who attended Julie's funeral, and even though he wasn't close family, he was the last person to leave. He also had been texting Julie constantly in the days leading up to her death. The police couldn't link the disappearance of Julie's body to the creepy fellow, and her body was never found. Number 2, a moving corpse. This one was written by Redditor the_8_Henry. He wrote about a story that his neighbor told him who works as a mortician. One day, the guy was doing his body prepping thing late at night. He had to wake early the next morning. He turned his back to grab some tools, and in the corner of his eye, he saw the body starting to sit up straight. Insane core strength. Well, of course that's the most terrifying thing that can happen to you, so the guy ran right out of the room. He had sprinted halfway up the stairs before he was like, oh yeah, I've been doing this for 20 years. That's just rigor mortis. I think if that happened to me, I would just quit my mortician job and take those skills and become a hairstylist. At number 9, we have the Brazilian zombie. Well, it seems that people weren't only buried alive in the past, when doctors only washed their hands when they took a big poo. In 2013, there was a lady walking through a graveyard. She was visiting a family's grave. She wasn't just hanging out there for no reason. But the reason doesn't matter. What she saw is the reason why you're here. She saw hands lift up out of a grave followed by a head. There was a man pulling himself out of his own grave. Now she called the paramedics to come help this guy, which is the right thing to do. I think I would have gotten on a plane and gone to a new country to avoid the zombie outbreak. The paramedics arrived and took the man to the hospital. He had almost been beaten to death. This took place in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and it seems that this might have been a gang attack and the people buried him to try and cover their tracks. At number 8, we have Watch Your Step. Alright guys, I'm going to go way back in time for this one. Could you imagine you're about to get married and then you die? Then everyone has to have a funeral for you, which is basically the opposite of a wedding. The year was 1571 and Matthew Wall was all dressed up and ready to head down to the church for his wedding when he bit the dust. You already have all your friends and family there, so might as well just flip the script and get the funeral going. Everyone was heartbroken. A hole was dug and Matthew's body was being carried in a coffin to his final resting place. Then one of the pallbearers slipped. Matthew's body banged against his own coffin and he was jolted back to life. Turns out he was just in a coma. He started banging on the coffin and then jumped out, and then everything flipped back into a wedding. Now the town of Brahing, Hertfordshire rings a bell every October 2nd on the day that Matthew was almost buried alive and then had a wedding. At number 7, we have 50% is almost a pass. The deeper you get into this, the more I am afraid of being buried alive. I should learn that wood punching technique from Kill Bill Volume 2 so I can punch my way out of a coffin if I ever get entombed too early. Well, Mary Nora didn't know the wood splitting fist technique, probably because she was a 17-year-old girl in France in 1971. I don't think it was common knowledge for the teens in France to know that. Well, she got cholera and she was set in a casket and it was nailed shut, and then she was lowered into the catacombs. Everyone thought she was dead at that moment. It wasn't until 10 years later when someone was going down into the catacombs to check some of the records and her body was found halfway out of her pine box. She had decayed into a skeleton, but it seems that what happened was she was alive at the time that she was laid to rest in the catacombs. She woke up out of her coffin, forced her way out, but when she saw that she was in the catacombs, she passed out and then smacked her head, which led to her death. She was so close to being free. At number 6, we have Open Up. This one is very similar to the last. It was 1850 in South Carolina. A young girl got a terrible sickness and was laid to rest in a mausoleum. This was the last time her family thought they would see her. But it was years later when they came to bury one of their sons in the mausoleum that they opened it up and found the girl's skeleton right on the other side of the door. It seemed that she rose up out of her coffin and tried to get through the doors but was unsuccessful. She most likely died from dehydration. At number 4, we have God's Plan. God's plan, man. You know God's plan. You don't get a chance like this very often. Maggie Dixon was sent to the gallows for her crime of letting her child die. She was having an affair, got pregnant, she kept it a secret, the baby didn't survive the delivery, and then she disposed of the corpse in secret, but it was found. Eventually was connected to Maggie, and now she had a date with the hangman. She was hanged, boxed up in a coffin, and then put on the back of a carriage that was taking her to the cemetery to be buried. But on the way there, she popped out of the coffin. Now you think people would suspect her of being some sort of monster, but that's not what happened at all. Everyone thought that this was the will of the Lord, that she'd been expunged by God for her crimes, and she was able to have a second shot at life. She got back together with her husband, and the two lived happily ever after. I don't think it can work out better than that. That's the best case scenario for getting caught after killing your kid. At number 3, we have sleeping sickness. Sleeping sickness is very strange. It's a disease that will take over a person's body, and it can kill them, but most of the time will knock them into a coma, and they will seem dead. In the 1800s, this was sweeping through a town in Kentucky. It got into the bones of Octavia Hatcher. Everyone thought she was dead, so the town had a funeral for her and she was buried. Then a week later, some of the people who had seemed to be dead but hadn't been buried started to come out of their comas. Octavia's husband put 2 and 2 together, and he had his wife dug up, but it was already too late and his worst fears were realized. There were scratch marks on the inside of her coffin, and her face had a terrifying expression on it because she was buried alive. At number 2, we have 2 for 2. Imagine waking up in a coffin not once but twice. The year was 1647, and Miss Blunden took a little bit too much milk of the poppy, which is something people would take for pain, and is also pretty much heroin. It knocked her into a coma, and the drug was so powerful that people thought she was dead, so they set up a funeral for her. She was buried, and then later that day some children were playing in the cemetery and they heard screams coming from her grave. So they dug her up and they found that she was covered in scratches, like she'd been trying to escape, but she had stopped moving, so everyone thought that they were too late in saving her and she was now dead for real this time. She was then buried again the next day and then dug up again so the coroner could find out how she died, only to find more scratches and ripped clothes. It seems when they dug her up the first time she was still alive, and then they reburied her, and then she struggled to get out again. And for the number 1 spot, we have Madame Bobbin. This one takes the cake, guys. It is the scariest one I could find. Madame Bobbin came back from Africa in 1905. She had yellow fever and was getting sicker and sicker. The worst part about this was that she was pregnant, and it meant that the baby, along with Madame Bobbin, might die. And sadly, those fears were met a few days later, and she was buried. After the funeral though, one of the nurses was talking to Madame Bobbin's father and was complaining that she thought Madame Bobbin was buried too soon, that her body was still warm when it was taken away from the hospital. Furious, her father had the grave dug up, and they found a horrible sight. Not only had Madame Bobbin been buried too early and suffocated in her coffin, but she also gave birth to her who lay dead in the coffin with her. This one is terrifying.